ultimately how you create the apps is a massive part of your workflow. This list taken from this gist on GitHub is just the ones that are built in JavaScript. At PagerDuty, we are using gulp, but we were previously using grunts. But I think you should just use whatever feels right. This is only the JavaScript-based ones. I think it's interesting. We've kind of gotten to the point in this community that there's even a backlash against using build tools in general. I think there's actually this new sub-movement of people who are like, I don't want to use any build tool. I'm just going to do it as a shell script or a makefile. So like we've gotten to a really advanced point in this battle, which brings us to number 3. I call it StarScript Battlefield number 3, which I reserve all rights to as a science fiction novel. It started, I would say, in about 2010. But even though this is Empire.js, you don't necessarily have to write JavaScript anymore if you want to build a web app. I kind of like to think of it in Madlib form. Like, I prefer to write in A because it makes creating B easier. I don't know if we have any DogeScript programmers in the house, but yeah, I mean, it's a constantly evolving list of languages that compile to JavaScript. Which finally brings us to the last battlefield I'm going to talk about, which is my dependency management tool is better than yours. Again, another very popular topic at JavaScript conferences. I've listed about 4 here. I hope I didn't offend anyone by leaving some more off. But I mean, these apps have gotten so complex that we've actually started to build tools that manage the dependency of using third-party libraries. And I think there are very good reasons behind this, and I won't be talking about why would you choose one or the other. But it's ultimately, I just want to talk about it more generally, it's another consideration you have to make when you're building an app. And again, I think it kind of talks to how advanced this has become, because we now have packages in NPM, like this debowerify package, that actually converts from one dependency management tool to another, which is just, I think, pretty incredible. So like we've all chosen sides, like when we're making these apps, and the end result is a fairly complex system that builds these apps. We have all of these considerations and things we have to think of that are in our mental model as developers when we're creating these apps. So it gets even more interesting when we start thinking about JavaScript apps inside of mobile or native applications. So I wanted to just kind of briefly share what we did at PagerDuty for this app. This is kind of getting into more of the case study stuff. But basically, we had this project, and we were thinking, oh yeah, let's just build it using the minimal set of libraries possible, like just the absolutely essential stuff, the stuff that it's painful for us to not have. And we still ended up with 8 or 9. I think there are even a couple more at this point. But I mean, you don't really want to write your own date parsing or date formatting library. So Moment.js comes in, and then there are all these awful inconsistencies around how touch events are handled across platforms, Android or iOS quirks. So you get Hammer and FastClick. FastClick's a great library from the Financial Times, dealing with that nasty 300 millisecond lag on certain types of touch events in mobile browsers and web views. Of course, going back to one of our other battlefields we talked about, the build tools themselves also have dependencies. So you have third-party dependencies that could be managed by a tool like Bower or Browserify, but then your build process itself, like gulp or grunt, 2 of the more popular JavaScript build tools, also have dependencies themselves. So of course, we wrote the app in CoffeeScript, we did Sass for CSS, and then we're doing a couple other things like asset fingerprints and concatenating files together. And all of those are implemented in these plugins for gulp, which are actually just thin wrappers around node streams. So, so our build tools themselves also have additional complexity. And so then you have this moment when you've built this app, you have this build system that's shiny, it's cool, it's even using the new gulp hotness, and then you're like, oh crap, this has to work in cross-platform web views. It's kind of I call it the face melt point. Which is where this still is, it comes from. I think this guy's face is about to melt in the movie. But that brings us to this whole idea of the mobile frontier. And I really, really enjoyed Dominic's talk yesterday, because I very much want the mobile web to succeed. But as an engineer at a company that makes an app that has to deliver push notifications, the reality is we have to package our JavaScript in a native app to meet basic customer demands. So we're using Cordova. Cordova is an Apache Foundation project that's also part of PhoneGap. I'm still a little bit fuzzy on the branding, but ultimately it's a library that PhoneGap uses, and they've done a really great job with build engineering and actually getting stuff to work in a cross-platform way and provided an interface between your JavaScript code and native code. But ultimately, if you're not familiar with Cordova or PhoneGap, all that's really happening is we have a full-page JavaScript web app that's in a UI web view in iOS that extends the Cordova web view. And all that does is load an index.html, and that's a single web page JavaScript app that comes out of our build system, and that's what people are actually interacting with in the PagerDuty app that's available on the store. And so the big question was, how do we share? So we have these artifacts that come out of our build system. How do we share those between our repositories for our iOS and Android apps? And I think the first approach, an approach a lot of people go down, is like, let's just put all the things in Git. So we've run our gulp tasks. We have HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that it spits out. Let's just check it into Git and just go from there. We'll use a Git submodule. We'll pull that optimized production source, and then just package it in the app. Easy enough. Unfortunately, we quickly ran into a lot of problems. There are three main ones. The first one is fairly practical. The Git submodules, I don't think I've never spoken to anyone who really enjoys working with Git submodules. And especially on a team, someone inevitably has a slightly different workflow for dealing with Git submodules, or they forget to clone the source and initialize the submodules. And it becomes this really annoying thing that, someone forgot to update to the remote submodule, and then it gets very messy, particularly in a team. The other thing, of course, is merge conflict hell. So when you're checking in this transformed production source into Git, you easily run into merge conflicts with other team members as you try and merge into master. And I'm speaking specifically of Git, but this is also true of any version control system where you're checking in source. And then, of course, there's the kind of the more theoretical aspect that we've known for a long time as software engineers. It's not generally a good idea or a best practice to check in binaries or ultimately transformed code into source control. So I think we're in good company when we do this sort of thing. Some anonymous, very popular JavaScript libraries. It's not uncommon to see a dist directory in a repository or a min directory. There's this idea that we've built this library. Let's give people an easy way to grab the source, to grab the minified source that they can run on their production systems, and that's very common. But we were thinking so we're running into these situations with merge conflicts and Git submodule purgatory. Can we use a better tool? And one of the things that the second thing we tried was NPM is just a very awesome dependency management tool. We understand the workflow, and it could potentially get us out of this Git submodule problem. And it seemed like we were supported with the documentation, and I really want to give NPM kudos for understanding that there's this idea that people aren't necessarily always going to write in JavaScript, and they have this really powerful deploy hook system, so you can say, hey, before I publish an NPM package to the NPM central repository, I'm going to run this shell script. And that's ultimately what they recommend if you're writing in CoffeeScript or another language, or probably have some complicated build system, is don't make the downstream consumers of your NPM package be aware of all the crazy things you did to actually build it. Just let them use JavaScript, have a pre-published script, you publish the JavaScript code that's final, and that's what actually people consume. And I think it's fundamentally the right way to look at it. So we did a similar thing. We tried to ultimately use NPM, but we pointed NPM to our GitHub repository. And the nice thing about that is you can actually specify a SHA or a tag name to pull from. But the problem with that is we then this is the package JSON in our Xcode in our iOS project. So the idea is you type npm install in this Xcode repository, this Objective-C Xcode repository, and it'll actually fetch this JavaScript web project and pull down all that stuff. But there were two main issues with that, and it was mostly because we were using it was private code. Like we didn't necessarily want to share our JavaScript packaged application with the world, and putting it in the npm repository would just be a very bad idea. So if we wanted to publish a for the native application, we had to kind of make a trade-off. It was like if we wanted a simple native application build, so an Objective-C or an Xcode build or an Android build using Maven or Gradle that didn't really care about how the JavaScript was built, we would have to go back to checking in the transformed code into Git because we were pulling from the Git repository. Conversely, if we didn't want to check in that transformed code into GitHub, we would then have to introduce the complexity of our JavaScript build system into these native projects. So Xcode would suddenly need to know how to build our JavaScript in gulp or grunt or whatever you're using. And so both of those necessarily weren't ideal either. And so, we were there and it worked, but we were like, okay, is there anything else we can do here? And ultimately, I mean, and we knew this, and everyone already knows this, but ultimately, like, after you build this app and you have this collection of static files that represent your production JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, it's ultimately just a build artifact. And we've known for a long time that there's generally a workflow for dealing with that sort of situation. And that's ultimately that app needs a place to live. It needs a home that's outside of source control, just to avoid some of these nasty issues we were dealing with. Ultimately, we ended up kind of discovering the GitHub release API. And discovering is probably the wrong word. We just realized it existed. The GitHub release API is a fairly new API. I believe it was released in September 2013. But the really nice thing is, if you're already using GitHub and you're kind of dealing with this dependency hell of like, oh, like I don't want Xcode to have to worry about how to build my JavaScript, or I don't want Android Studio to have to call into gulp or grunt, it kind of offers a fairly nice workaround because it allows you to associate any tag in your GitHub repository with a collection of binary blobs, which I think are ultimately just stored in S3 by GitHub. And it also has API access. You can script that as well. But the nice thing is, once you go through that process, you have your gulp CLI builds it. It's posted up to the GitHub release API. It exists in S3 associated with some tag in your project. And then anything downstream that actually needs to consume that application can just curl it, basically. So a little bit of build engineering here. There's no gulp or grunt plugin for the GitHub release API, but it's fairly straightforward. If you're using gulp, you can do all the stream magic here. You can create the zip archive. You set some headers, and then you just create a read stream and you pipe it up to the GitHub release API. So that was kind of nice. And then similarly in Xcode, one of my colleagues wrote, a 20-line Ruby script that just pulls it down from the GitHub release API repository. And there are a couple jumps. The release API isn't super well documented, but it's fairly straightforward to get something working. Ultimately, I mean, where does that leave us? I think. In no way I think this is necessarily the best option or like the best option for all time going forward, but I think this narrow slice of the whole workflow is something that definitely needs more attention as we build apps that have multiple platforms. As we kind of create JavaScript that we know is going to have to run on in a slightly different context than a regular web browser, it's something I think we're going to have to think about more in the future, and kind of using build artifacts as a starting point for the discussion, and trying to simplify builds that consume your apps is at least a decent place to start. In the future, it seems like other people are obviously thinking about this as well. There's a really great discussion going around build tools right now. One interesting thing is people are starting to build NPM bridges into other artifact repositories like Sonatype Nexus. So I think the idea is, in this issue, you can follow on the Sonatype issue, but this developer has actually written a bridge where you can npm install and it'll fetch the package from Sonatype, which is pretty interesting. And that also kind of brings us to the idea of, private NPM or just generally repositories that implement common JS specs. Possibly using that for build artifacts. I'm really uncertain whether that's really the best way necessarily, but I think it's something to think about. And lastly, I think the idea once you've decided to say, hey, I want some sort of static representation of my app, all of these static files that my build system generates, it wouldn't be necessarily out of the question to to write a couple of 20 or 30 line scripts that just store it in S3 or even an FTP server or something. I'm reluctant to say like, oh, you have to use something as heavyweight as a traditional artifact repository manager or something like the GitHub release API, especially if you don't use GitHub. But ultimately, the idea of having some static representation of your app somewhere that will exist, I think, is an incredibly useful thing for certain types of complex JavaScript build workflows. But yeah, thanks, guys. That's pretty much it. There's kind of a blog on a companion blog post on the PagerDuty blog, and if you learn anything from this talk, I think it's really definitely think twice before checking in anything that ends in .min.js. But thank you. Yeah.